series going through the Gospel of John. And today we're going to look at the first part of John chapter 9, the healing of the man born blind. And it's very important that we take note that the purpose of this particular miracle is that the work of God might be displayed. All of these signs in John's Gospel, and we've looked at them before, and can you move the cursor, please? You still there, James? That's better. Go back one. Said before, there's 8 signs in John's Gospel, and this is number 6. They're all prophetic for the last days, all for the church and all for Israel, although actually I think this one about the healing of the man born blind is actually pertinent both to Israel and the church. And I'll be mentioning that later. And also, on my final slide today, there's a bit of a link with some of the things that Chris Cartwright was just saying. So this is the 6th sign. It's a healing miracle. There are other healing miracles there, aren't there? There's the healing of the official's son, the healing of the man with an infirmity at the pool of Bethesda, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and the healing of the man born blind. Now, I'm finding it absolutely fascinating studying the Gospel of John. Because the thing about John's Gospel is that it's chronological. The other Gospels just give you different insights into the ministry of Jesus. And in many ways, they can be quite random. You don't know what comes first or what comes second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. But John's Gospel is in time order, which means that you can create a timeline. Now, you don't have to worry too much about the dates. If you don't like dates, you can forget dates. I like dates, because somehow being able to put a date on there, it's like visiting Israel. Things become more real. So Jesus was baptized, and then he started his ministry at age 30, we discover in Luke chapter 3. The first Passover that he went to in John 2, when he overturned the tables for the first time in the temple. Then we have the healing of the pool of Bethesda, the Day of Atonement. The reason you can trace these through is because he uses the feasts and these days to say what's going on. And once you've got one date, you can easily work out the others. Jesus' main ministry begins after the imprisonment of John the Baptist, we read in Matthew 4, which was sometime in autumn. Feeding the 5,000, which was close to the 3rd Passover of his ministry. The 3rd Feast of Tabernacles, which I talked about a few weeks ago in John 7. Then the healing of the man born blind on the Sabbath immediately following that Feast of Tabernacles. And then when we get on to John 10 in a couple of weeks' time, that took place what they call the Feast of Dedication, which was Hanukkah, which is not particularly a biblical feast, but it's one very much celebrated by the Jewish people. And it comes out of the Apocrypha, not the Bible. And then finally, in the 4th Passover, Jesus is crucified. So you can see that trend going through it. And the other thing that I've discovered as I've put all that together is as we'll see as we get on to the second part of this chapter next week, you will see just how much Jesus is winding up the Pharisees and the Jews and the scribes. As I say, it begins at that first Passover in John 2, goes into the temple, throws the tables everywhere, causes a stir. The healing at the pool of Bethesda caused another stir. John 7, Feast of Tabernacles, yet another stir, where he told, and then moving on into chapter 8, he tells the Pharisees they're of their father the devil, things like that. My goodness. And then we come to John chapter 9. So let's just read that. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life." That's actually quite different from the healing in the pool of Bethesda. Because if you remember there, one of the things that Jesus says to the man after he's been healed is effectively, go and sin no more. Something worse might happen. We talked about that a few weeks ago. But in this case, it's not to do with the man's sin. It's that the glory of God might be revealed and displayed. Jesus goes on to say, "As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and washed. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. And they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was, you can guess it, can't you? It was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." There's a lot that could be said about this passage. And if I really wanted to cover it properly, it would probably take about a week of Bible studies. But so we're not going to do all of that this morning. But one of the things that must be significant is the pool of Siloam. This blind man was the only one that Jesus healed by putting mud on his eyes and sending him off to wash in the pool of Siloam. So there must be some significance in that. So what was this pool of Siloam? Well, actually, from what I can discover, it was the Jerusalem end of Hezekiah's tunnel. Now, Hezekiah was king of Judah in 700 odd BC. And at one point, he was besieged by the Assyrians. It happened at the same time as Assyria took the northern kingdom of Israel into exile. And in order to keep Jerusalem having fresh water during this siege, he ordered the building of this tunnel. So the water that was coming into Jerusalem came underground through this tunnel. That's the only real significance that I can see in the pool of Siloam. So what is that a picture of? I think it's a picture of the water of life that comes from Jesus, flowing beneath the surface. And as such, it's a kind of picture of the underground church in our age. And for the age in which Jesus was living, it's a picture of the remnant in Israel that were faithful to the coming of the Messiah. You can read all about that in Isaiah 7, 8, 9, and a little bit in 1 Chronicles 30. As I say, I haven't got time to go into all that. But if we compare the remnant people of that God had sort of marked as those that would follow him through from the time of Hezekiah. I mean, it began, if not before. I mean, it's always been there since Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Not all Israel is what Paul says. Those that are being faithful to the coming of the Messiah are the remnants. And we saw it in the story of Elijah, don't we, where God says to Elijah, I have reserved to me 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So this water that heals the blind man, is a picture of something that's been flowing through history, representing the remnant of Israel. And it's still there today, representing the true church of Jesus in this day and age. Now, the church in this country is not particularly underground yet. But I said these things are prophetic, didn't I? So the man goes and washes in this water. Remember in John chapter 7, Jesus had just said, if you're thirsty, come to me, I'm the water of life. In John 4, he talked about having water with the woman in Samaria. Water is an important symbol here that Jesus uses for the Holy Spirit flowing through us. And as the man washes in this water, he can see again. Now, whether he was part of that remnant before, I actually don't think he was. Because it says, the man washed and came home seeing. Once I was blind, now I see. Praise the Lord. We're all blind until Jesus opens our eyes to see him. So he becomes part of those believers in Jesus. And he immediately gets persecuted, and that's for next week. One of the other things I just wanted to point out about these signs in John's Gospel is, as I said, there's 4 healing miracles there. And unusually, compared to the other Gospels, Jesus actually initiates 3 of these. And the other one is initiated by a Gentile ruler coming and asking Jesus to heal his son. In other words, the people aren't actually, certainly the Jews, aren't actually coming to Jesus to receive healing. He's going to them. Jesus is the initiator in 3 of these. He's the initiator in the healing at the pool of Bethesda. He's the initiator here. It says in verse 1 of chapter 9, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. You don't think that was just coincidence? Just as it wasn't coincidence when he went to the pool of Bethesda. Jesus was seeking out this man. And he seeks out you and me to open our eyes. And Jesus initiated the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead. That's the third one. Jesus is the initiator of these things. So it stands quite in contrast to the man at the pool of Bethesda, as I've said before. So I'll move over on to the next point. The other thing is, as I was reading about this, I caught something on a website that actually suggested that possibly, I suppose if you think resurrecting people from the dead is the greatest miracle, which in many ways it is, but in terms of healing, this was probably the greatest miracle that Jesus ever did. Or because this man had been blind from birth. Now, we don't know about the other blind people that he healed. It may be that they'd been able to see once. But what this website was pointing out was that we don't just see with our eyes. We see with our brains. It's a known fact, and it has been tested, hasn't it, that the image that comes into our eye when it goes into the brain is upside down. I don't know if you knew that. Anna's nodding. The brain has to turn it round to get it the right way up. The brain has to interpret what it is that we're looking at. The brain has to interpret that we're looking at a man as opposed to a tree, which was to some degree the case in one of the other healings in the Gospels. How did this man cope when he'd never seen anything before in his life? Nothing at all, not even as a baby. Never seen his mother's face. Perhaps been able to touch things, form some kind of view, but he'd never seen before. So this wasn't just a healing of the man's eyes, it was a healing of his whole concept, his whole personality in many ways. It was a healing going on in his brain that was instant. So it's possibly one of the greatest miracles of the lot. But as I said at the beginning, all of these signs have a prophetic meaning for the end times. those that saw this happen were divided. It says, I'm trying to find the verse, but I can't immediately see it. But somewhere in there it said they were divided. Some thought that it was the man himself. Some thought it was somebody else. Jesus brings division. And as I said earlier on, we saw that in some of the earlier signs. And we see it again here. And I would suggest that as this happens, when did it happen? Shortly after the Feast of Tabernacles, the final Feast of Tabernacles before Jesus was crucified, the anger of those opposed to Jesus is beginning to reach a crescendo. Next week we'll be reading about what the Pharisees wanted to do with Jesus yet again. And that division continues today. There are those that are opposed to Jesus. There are those that accept Jesus. And increasingly, and to some extent, Chris touched on this a little bit. In my view, probably not enough. As we approach the end times, the persecution of the church is going to increase. Because this is a picture of it. The more Jesus does, the more it causes division, the more persecution will increase from those who will not believe, and the more suffering and rejoicing from those who do believe. And eventually this becomes the last straw on Palm Sunday. On Palm Sunday we see Jesus coming into Jerusalem and the crowds rejoicing, shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, save us now. They're all rejoicing in Jesus coming into Jerusalem as the king. But how many of them meant it? And that's a problem in the church today. There's lots of folks rejoicing, supposedly, in Jesus. But when push comes to shove, we'll be shouting, crucify him, crucify him, a week later. I didn't realize it until we started studying the Gospel of John, just how prophetic that whole book is. In many ways, even more so than the book of Revelation, which John also wrote. He was probably one of the greatest prophets, was John the disciple. But in the midst of all this, the remnant believers' witness increases. And we see that's symbolized by this man. And that's where it says they were divided. Verse 16. How can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And the man replied, he's a prophet. He began to witness immediately. He began to witness to what Jesus had done for him. The one thing he knew was once he was blind and now he can see. And our witness and testimony should be very similar to that. There's so much that we need our eyes opening to, particularly in these last days. So for the Jews, this is a prophetic sign that as the last days approach, there will be division amongst the Jewish people, for those who are believing in the Messiah and those who aren't. But that doesn't just apply to Israel and to the Jews. It applies just as much to us in the church, doesn't it? Some people's eyes will be opened to accept the Messiah until, as Paul puts it, the full number of the Gentiles comes in, and at that point Jesus returns. And we'll see him as he is in all his glory. Now that is the work of God that this miracle was meant to display. The work of God in opening people's eyes to see who Jesus really is. The work of God in giving us that vision of Jesus. The work of God in causing us to testify to what he has done for us. As I said, there's so much more that we could talk about in this passage, but I'm going to stop there. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you this morning, Lord, for the eyes that you have opened in this place, that we might see you, that we might know who you are, that we might benefit, Lord, from all that you've done for us, all that you've shown us, all that you've given us. Indeed, that your works are being displayed in us. And we thank you for that, Lord.